Number 47892. That's all she was supposed to be. A number tattooed on her arm. A face loss among 130,000 women imprisoned in Ravensbrück concentration camp. But Rachel Goldstein had something the Nazis couldn't tattoo away. The tactical mind of a former intelligence officer who had served in the Polish resistance. What they didn't know was that this helpless Jewish woman was already planning the most audacious escape in the camp's history. October 1943. The cattle car doors scraped open with a sound like breaking bones. Rachel Goldstein, 28 years old, stepped onto the platform at Ravensbrück with 90 other women from the Warsaw Ghetto. The air tasted of smoke and fear. Before the war, Rachel had been Lieutenant Rachel Kowalski in the Polish Army's Intelligence Corps, one of the few women officers in military intelligence. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, she'd gone underground with the resistance, using her training to coordinate safe houses and escape routes. But someone had betrayed her network. The Gestapo had been waiting. Now, as she stood in the gray October morning, watching SS guards separate women into groups with casual brutality, Rachel forced herself to think like the intelligence officer she'd been. Observe, assess, survive, plan. You Jewish women to the left, barked an SS guard. Rachel moved with the group, but her eyes were already mapping the camp. Guard positions, fence lines, daily routines. Every detail filed away in a mind trained for military reconnaissance. The registration process was designed to strip away identity. Head shaved, clothes confiscated. Assigned number 47892. But they couldn't confiscate experience or training. In the cramped barracks that first night, surrounded by the sounds of weeping and whispered prayers, Rachel made contact with other Polish women. Many were resistance fighters like herself, captured in the ongoing underground war against the occupation. "We survive first," she whispered to Maria Kowalczyk, a former saboteur from Krakow. "Then we fight back." Rachel's military background became her greatest asset. While other prisoners focused on day-to-day survival, she was planning for long-term resistance. She identified potential allies across different barracks and nationalities: French resistance fighters, Norwegian teachers, Soviet partisans. The work assignments became opportunities for reconnaissance. When detailed to the camp's electrical workshop, Rachel memorized the layout of the administrative buildings. When assigned to kitchen duty, she learned the guards' meal schedules and shift changes. But Ravensbrück was held designed by experts in human suffering. The daily reality was starvation, disease, random brutality, and the constant presence of death. Rachel watched women around her break, fade, disappear. Each morning's roll call revealed new empty spaces where friends had stood the day before. Dr. Karl Gebhardt's medical experiments were the camp's special horror. Rachel watched healthy women disappear into the hospital block and return maimed or not at all. The doctor was testing sulfur drugs by deliberately infecting wounds with bacteria, gangrene, and tetanus. Those who survived carried lifelong disabilities. "We have to document this," Rachel told her growing network of resistance contacts. Using scraps of paper and makeshift ink made from charcoal and water, she began keeping detailed records of the medical experiments, guard rotations, and camp administration. The network grew carefully. French women like Genevieve de Gaulle Antonios, General de Gaulle's niece, provided intelligence about Allied movements whispered through clandestine radio contact. Soviet women shared information about German troop movements they'd observed during transport. Polish women coordinated with newer arrivals to map the expanding network of subcamps. But survival required more than intelligence gathering. It required hope. Rachel organized what she called invisible resistance, small acts of defiance that kept spirits alive. Hidden classes where educated women taught others to read and write. Secret religious services held in the cramped spaces between barracks. Careful sabotage of war production. Uniforms sewn with intentional flaws, electrical components assembled incorrectly. The most important resistance was maintaining their humanity. Rachel instituted a system where stronger women looked after the weak, where small portions of food were shared with those too sick to work, where news from the outside world was carefully circulated to maintain morale. By spring 1944, Rachel's network had grown to include over 200 women across multiple barracks. They had detailed maps of the camp, knowledge of guard routines, and contact with resistance groups in nearby villages. But escape seemed impossible. The camp was surrounded by electrified fences, watchtowers, and miles of hostile countryside. Then came the opportunity Rachel had been waiting for. In April 1944, a transport of new prisoners included several women from the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. Among them was Captain Katerina Volkov, a communications expert who had been captured during reconnaissance behind German lines. "I still have contacts," Katerina whispered during a clandestine meeting in the camp's latrines. "Partisan groups operating in the forest north of here. If we can get word to them." Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. A coordinated escape wouldn't just save their own lives. It could provide Allied intelligence with detailed information about the camp, the medical experiments, and German defensive positions. The plan was audacious. During the camp's monthly medical inspection, when security was focused on the hospital block, a team of 12 women would create a diversion in the main yard. While guards responded to what appeared to be a prisoner riot, Rachel and 5 other women would cut to the fence at a predetermined weak point identified through months of careful observation. The timing had to be perfect. The diversion team, led by Genevieve de Gaulle Antonios, would stage a protest demanding better treatment for sick prisoners. The noise and confusion would draw guards from the perimeter. Meanwhile, Rachel's escape team would have exactly 7 minutes to cut through the fence and reach the forest before the next guard patrol. But the plan required sacrifice. The women creating the diversion knew they would face severe punishment, possibly execution. Yet each volunteer stepped forward without hesitation. "We've lived as numbers," Genevieve said during their final planning meeting. "Let's die as human beings fighting back." May 15, 1944. The morning arrived gray and cold, with low clouds that would provide cover once they reached the forest. Rachel had barely slept, running through the plan repeatedly in her mind. At 2:30 p.m., during the afternoon work detail, Genevieve's team gathered in the main yard. They began with a simple protest, demanding medical attention for the women dying in the hospital block. Within minutes, it escalated into a full confrontation with the guards. "Murderers!" Genevieve shouted, her voice carrying across the camp. "History will remember what you've done here." Other prisoners joined in, some spontaneously, others following prearranged signals. The yard filled with hundreds of voices raised in defiance, the first open rebellion in Ravensbrück's history. SS guards rushed from their posts to contain the situation. Whistles blew, dogs barked. In the chaos, no one noticed 6 women slipping away from their work details toward the eastern fence. Rachel's hands were steady as she used wire cutters smuggled from the electrical workshop to cut through the fence. Behind her, the other 5 women, Katerina Volkov, Maria Kowalczyk, and 3 French resistance fighters, waited in tense silence. The first strand of wire parted with a soft ping. Then the second, through the growing gap. Rachel could see the dark line of forest just 200 meters away. "Now," she whispered. They crawled to a fence one by one, their prison uniforms snagging on the wire. Behind them, the sound of the riot continued. Guards shouting orders, prisoners singing Polish and French resistance songs, dogs barking frantically. Rachel was the last through the fence. As she stood and looked back at the camp one final time, she saw Genevieve being dragged away by guards. Their eyes met across the distance, and Genevieve raised her fist in salute. Then Rachel turned and ran toward the forest, toward freedom, carrying with her the documentation that would expose Ravensbrück's horrors to the world. The forest was dense and disorienting. Rachel's military training proved invaluable as she led the group using compass navigation and terrain features to maintain direction. They moved only at night, hiding during daylight hours in abandoned barns or thick underbrush. On the second night, they made contact with Soviet partisans operating behind German lines. The partisans were initially suspicious. Escaped prisoners were sometimes German agents attempting to infiltrate resistance networks. But Katerina's knowledge of Soviet military codes convinced them the escape was genuine. "We have radio contact with Moscow," the partisan commander told them. "Your intelligence about the camp will reach Allied headquarters within days." Rachel's detailed documentation of the medical experiments, guard positions, and administrative structure provided crucial intelligence. Within weeks, Allied bombing raids would target supply lines to Ravensbrück, and war crimes investigators would begin preparing cases against camp personnel. But the journey to safety was far from over. They spent 3 weeks moving through German-occupied territory, guided by partisan networks and hidden by sympathetic civilians who risked their lives to help. The most dangerous moment came at a German checkpoint near the Polish border. Rachel's false identity papers, prepared by the partisans, identified her as a Polish farm worker. The German officer examining her documents was suspicious. Her hands were too soft for manual labor, her posture too military. "You were a soldier," he said in German, studying her face. Rachel met his gaze steadily and replied in Polish, pretending not to understand. The officer called for a translator, but before one could arrive, Allied aircraft appeared overhead. In the confusion of the air raid, Rachel and her companions slipped away into the chaos. By July 1944, Rachel had reached Allied lines and was debriefing intelligence officers about conditions in Ravensbrück. Her testimony, combined with evidence from other escapees and resistance networks, provided crucial documentation of Nazi war crimes. The information she provided helped save lives. Allied intelligence used her maps and guard schedules to plan supply drops to resistance networks still operating near the camp. Her documentation of the medical experiments provided evidence that would later be used in the Nuremberg trials. Meanwhile, back at Ravensbrück, the women who had participated in the diversion were facing brutal punishment. Genevieve de Gaulle Antonio spent months in solitary confinement. Several other participants were executed. But word of the successful escape had spread through the camp, providing hope that the outside world would learn of their suffering. Rachel rejoined Allied intelligence services, working with British and American forces to coordinate with resistance networks across occupied Europe. Her expertise in German camp operations proved invaluable in planning liberation efforts. When Soviet forces finally liberated Ravensbrück on April 30th, 1945, they found evidence that confirmed everything Rachel had reported. The medical experimentation block, the crematorium, the administrative records of systematic murder, all exactly as she had documented. After the war, Rachel testified at the Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crimes proceedings. Her detailed documentation and photographic evidence helped convict Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who was executed in 1948, and numerous camp guards and administrators. But victory was bittersweet. Of the 200 women in her resistance network, fewer than 50 survived the war. Genevieve de Gaulle Antonios lived through her imprisonment and became a lifelong advocate for human rights. Maria Kowalczyk was executed just weeks before liberation. Katerina Volkov died of typhus during the harsh winter of 1944-45. Rachel returned to Poland briefly after the war, but found her homeland devastated and under Soviet occupation. Like many Holocaust survivors, she eventually emigrated, settling in Israel where she joined the Israeli intelligence services. She never spoke publicly about her escape from Ravensbrück until the 1960s, when historians began documenting survivor testimonies. Even then, she focused not on her own heroism, but on the women who had made her survival possible. "I escaped because 200 women chose to help me," she said in a 1967 interview. "Every one of them was braver than I was. Every one of them deserved to survive." Rachel Goldstein lived until 1998, dedicating her later years to Holocaust education and supporting fellow survivors. She established a foundation providing psychological support for concentration camp survivors and their families. But her most important legacy was the documentation she had smuggled out of Ravensbrück. Those scraps of paper, written in makeshift ink and hidden in her clothing during the escape, became crucial evidence in understanding the full scope of Nazi crimes against women. Today, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum displays some of Rachel's original documentation alongside testimonies from other Ravensbrück survivors. Her story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, courage and intelligence could triumph over evil. The memorial plaque at the former Ravensbrück campsite includes words that Rachel wrote in her post-war memoir. "We survived not because we were stronger, but because we chose to remain human." In the face of systematic cruelty, maintaining our compassion for one another was itself an act of resistance. Rachel Goldstein's escape from Ravensbrück wasn't just a story of individual survival. It was proof that even in the most hopeless circumstances, organized resistance was possible. Her military training gave her the skills to plan and execute the escape, but it was the courage of ordinary women who made it successful. The 6 women who escaped that day saved not only their own lives, but provided crucial intelligence that helped Allied forces understand and eventually stop the Nazi killing machine. Their story reminds us that heroism comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a dramatic moment of cutting through a fence, but more often it's a daily choice to help others and maintain hope when all seems lost. What about you? When faced with injustice, do you have the courage to act? Do you have the strength to help others even when it puts you at risk? From which city are you watching this story of courage and resistance? Share in the comments and tell us about other stories of heroism that inspire you to be better. If stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the darkest of times move you, subscribe to hear more incredible tales of human courage. Because these stories must never be forgotten, and the lessons they teach us remain as important today as they were 80 years ago.